So this session has been titled with a very catchy, "Pioneer Voice Has Weight, Let's Advocate." It's presented for the HFA Virtual Fly-In, and as mentioned, I'm Will Hubbert. So this session starts with this question, what is advocacy? I always tell people when I'm presenting this, I hope you have at least some idea of what advocacy is, because if you're here and you don't know, it might be too late. But the good news is all of you do know, but it's honestly tricky. You know, when I got hired for this job at NPF, I was like, oh, my job title is Grassroots and Advocacy Manager. I should look up both those words and figure out what they mean. And Webster's dictionary defines advocacy as the act or process of advocating for something, which is kind of circular, right? It's like, what's advocacy? Oh, it's when you advocate, you know? What's it mean to advocate? Oh, that's when you do advocacy. So a better definition that they give is the act or process of supporting a cause or proposal. And then I think the definition that's best for us is the act of standing up for what you believe in, or the act of telling your story. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. So on the bottom, we have sort of three outcomes of advocacy we like to look at. I've heard this both at HFA and at NPF. Awareness, which is sort of the least labor intensive or the easiest to attain, just like, I know you exist. You know, you're the hemophilia or the bleeding disorders community. I know what that entails. I know what your issues are. You are on my radar. Support is a little bit more concrete. It's a bit of a commitment. You know, in addition to knowing who you are and what your issues are, I know that there's this bill coming up that affects copays or affects step therapy. And yeah, you have my support. I'll co-sponsor it. I'll speak about it on the floor. You know, it's a bit more of, it's easy to get someone to know who you are. It takes a bit more work to get them to do something for you. And then at the last level, we have influence, which is, it's not just support on a limited topic, it's an ongoing relationship where next time a bill comes about step therapy or accumulators, they'll reach out to us. You know, it's not just that I know who you are and I'm doing something for you, it's that you really have my ear. I want to hear from you when these issues come up. And that's sort of the most intense outcome we can sort of push for. So something I hope you noticed about all the definitions of advocacy I gave is that they're very, very broad, right? There's nothing in there about the Senate, about the House. It's just about sort of speaking up for yourself. And so I tell people who are doing this for the first time, again, it doesn't sound like this group, but when I do this talk for groups who are sort of dipping their toe in, I tell them, even if you've never done this type of advocacy, you've done advocacy before, even if you don't realize it, because advocacy is all around us. And to illustrate that point, I use this story which Sandra really enjoys. So this is me. This is young me. I've sort of lost a little hair up here, gained a little here, but you know, other than that, basically the same. And young me really, really wanted a dog. That was it. That was sort of priority number uno. And I was persistent. I would hold my breath. I would beg. I would cry. I would write contracts, which listed in like incredible detail how we would divide up the chores and responsibilities associated with owning a dog. Because my mother, in a cruel, callous act, did not want a dog, citing the fact that both me and my father were to some extent allergic. But, you know, we persisted, we kept pushing on, and eventually we got the dog. And this is me in Shadow, who was my childhood pet growing up. I don't have proof of this because I've never gotten a straight answer from her, but I suspect that these episodes were when my mom began to think that I could get involved with advocacy. So my childhood antics might have profoundly changed my life, because she was like, this kid's just so darn persistent and even annoying when he wants something from an authority figure. Let's see if we can use those qualities for good. And she started taking me to advocacy days. And that's sort of how I got to where I am today, you know, just begging and screaming for the dog. And I have matured a little bit, I'd like to think. I use different tactics now in legislative affairs. I don't hold my breath. I don't get back at someone who didn't vote for a bill by putting a whoopee cushion on their seat. But, you know, it's a lot of the same skills, sort of speaking up for yourself, articulating your needs, telling people who you are and what you want. These are all basically the same as what I did all those years ago. And that's really the big takeaway I want everyone to come away from this talk with. So what does advocacy look like? Here we have a bunch of pictures of people doing advocacy. Like I said, I've given this talk a lot. I didn't really glance at this slide too much when I was putting it together. I promise I do have other shirts besides the one I'm wearing both in this picture and today. You know, that's just a coincidence. I do have other colored shirts, I promise. But here we have a lot of pictures of members of our community doing advocacy. I can see some of you actually in these pictures. So the eagle-eyed among you can sort of play Where's Waldo with all your friends on this call and see who you can see. But the point I want to make here is that advocacy is not just the Mr. Smith goes to Washington. It's also not just being a kid bawling on the floor because he wants a dog. So HFA is involved in advocacy in a lot of different ways, and I just want to go over some of them. So advocating for yourself at school, you know, going to the gym teacher and saying, I might have a bleed, I might need to miss a couple of days of PE, here's what that looks like. Or talking to the school nurse about storing factor at the school if you're away and you can't come to help your son or your child infuse. These are all sort of aspects of advocacy. You need to stand up for yourself. You need to articulate your needs. And this is something that HFA can help you with. They have a great back to school toolkit. Advocating for yourself at work, you know, making connections with HR, discussing how a bleeding disorder might affect your work, when it might come up and what you might need. These are also aspects of advocacy. And HFA puts out great materials on this, some of which I used when I was actually applying for the job at NPF. So never think that you can't learn something from this stuff. I've presented some of these materials, and yet when it was my turn to sort of go on the job hunt, I turned to them. And it's plugging HFA a little bit, some of this stuff, it really is great. So why advocate? Again, this is the second question where it's like, if you don't have an answer, it might be too late. You're here hearing this talk at an advocacy event. I hope you have your own answer for why you want to advocate. But I kept this slide in anyways, because this is the part where I get to be mind freak. I don't know if any of you have seen that sort of David Blaine, you know, blowing people's mind thing. But the question is, which of these stones is brighter? And I'll let people answer, and they'll be like, oh, you know, the bottom one's brighter. The top one's obviously darker. And that's where I mind freak them, because you see they're actually the same color. It's an optical illusion. And the point of this, which is a very cliche point, but I'll say it anyways, is that advocacy is all about helping people see things in a different way, right? You have a different perspective on the world as a person with a bleeding disorder or as a family member of someone with a bleeding disorder. And you might have additional walks of life or additional life experiences that give you even more perspectives, like Randy's time in office or Steve's position in the healthcare industry. All of these things give us additional insight into how this system works and how it doesn't, and how we can reform the system to better work for us. And so that's really the value of all of you being here as advocates. You know, usually I say that we're not as polished or well-trained or well-rehearsed as the professional lobbyists. With this group, that might honestly not be true. You might be just as good as those people. But even if you're not, even if you're feeling a little bit nervous, which happens to all of us, they want to hear from us because we have life experience as people with this condition, right? There are people who are incredibly slick corporate lobbyists who have all the facts at their fingertips, who make six-figure salaries doing this for a living, but what they don't have is the lived experience of life with a bleeding disorder. And that's what you have to bring to bear in these meetings in the next few days. So again, I think all of you have great reasons for advocating, seeing as so many of you have drastically uprooted your life to be more involved with advocacy at the state and national level. But for those of you who are like, why do we do this? The good news is that by engaging in these efforts, by going out and telling our stories and articulating our needs, people like us can change things. And here in this slide, we have a picture of a seatbelt, which is something that through advocacy was made standard, and a picture of someone smoking on a plane, which through advocacy was made not standard. And I like both of these examples because they really did come from the ground up. If you study the history of them, these weren't things that legislators just intuitively knew we need to do something about this. People needed to come to them and explain why these were issues and why they could be addressed through some legislative solution. And that's sort of what we're going to be doing over the next few days. So through advocacy, you can raise awareness, you can address a problem, and you can call for change. So again, here we have a picture of the Maryland chapter, I believe, having passed a bill on out-of-pocket or step therapy. I forget which off the top of my head. And this is just an example of what we can accomplish. There's lots of members of the community who you may recognize in this photo. And the reason I like this is because it shows that we're not doing this alone, right? It's not that each individual advocate was going into those meetings without any help. It's not even that it was just the bleeding disorders community who was advocating for these changes. Other chronic conditions were also pushing for this bill. And the takeaway is that we can do a lot when we join forces. And that's really what I want everyone to keep in mind. So now we're reaching the sort of meat and potatoes of this call or this talk. This is all about telling your story, which is a bit, it's a bit of a buzzword, right? Everyone's tell your story this, tell your story that, but it really is just so important to all of this because say you went to Congress and you wanted to talk about the condition of animals in zoos. You talk for a little bit and they're like, well, why do I care what you have to say? Are you a zookeeper? Do you work for an animal welfare organization? Why should I take your thoughts on this subject seriously? And this is the same way. You're talking about these issues, you're coming to them today because you're a person with a bleeding disorder and these issues affect your life. And so really the art of this sort of storytelling is making the connection between your own experience as a person in this community, connecting that to the legislative ask. Here's who I am, here's the condition I have, here's how it affects me. We're here today to talk about copay accumulators. Here's how copay accumulators might affect me. So it's not two separate things. It's not just here's who I am, here's the legislative issue. You're really drawing an explicit connection between the two. And this talk is just designed to offer you some tools to do that. So why is this important? Like I said, it makes the issue come to life. These bills can be very dry. Something I've learned quickly as I've started doing this professionally with MPF is you'll read the bill sometimes and it'll be like, oh, we're changing the word is to the word are after, November 2022, November 15th, 2022. And it's like, well, what's that actually mean? And then I have to call someone who actually has a law degree to explain it. And so this stuff can seem dry, it can seem denser, just very abstract. And storytelling puts a personal face on it. It's, here's how this bill, which you may not have thought that hard about in its personal repercussions, here's how it would affect me as a parent of children with bleeding disorders or as a person with a bleeding disorder. Just intuitively, humans are wired to remember stories. They're a great way to pass along knowledge. They're a great way to illustrate larger points. And finally, stories help elected officials do their jobs. Ultimately, these people want to hear from you. They want to hear how their decisions affect you. They may even use your stories to speak on the Hill, to illustrate a point they're making to their colleagues. I'll tell you anecdotally, in my new job, about half of my responsibility is finding patients with specific stories. We'll be advocating for a bill in a specific state, and they'll be like, we need a woman with psoriatic arthritis who's recently had to switch health plans. Or, we'll need a small business owner who's insuring someone with this type of very specific condition. And they want those stories because they really illustrate and drive home specific implications of the law. And that's what you're here to share. And that's what your story can do in this context, if you really marry your specific circumstances to the larger political issues. So telling your story 101, again, I don't think you need this, but people remember stories and not facts. So it's great to have one or two statistics. If you're talking about accumulators and you say, oh, and X percent of people in our community are on a plan that has an accumulator, for instance. That's a great stat to use, but I can't tell you the number a week later. I can tell you what it was like when you learned that your copay assistance wouldn't be counted towards your out-of-pocket, and how that affected you. But that number is just going to go in one year and out the other. So we have great leave behinds that the entire policy team has put together that have those sorts of numbers that people can refer to. But ultimately, they can find those numbers either by looking at our leave behinds or by doing research on their own time. What they can't find is your personal experience. So always use those sort of hard facts, but use them sparingly and remember that your own experiences take precedence. Another point that I think is great here is keeping it simple. I had this experience recently. I was asking one of my coworkers, like, we have this HTC system. What's the arrangement of, specialized clinics, or is there sort of an equivalent? And they looked at me like, what's an HTC? And I'm like, oh yeah, that's not obvious to everyone. So like I say, you're all experts in your own condition. And sometimes you can be such an expert that you forget other people haven't been living with and thinking about bleeding disorders for decades. So this is just a reminder. Again, this is something that happens to me all the time, but keep it simple and remember that other people might be hearing about this condition and our issues for the first time. So just always phrasing in approachable language, asking people if they know what you mean, if it ever seems like they're not following you on something, just making sure that you're, without being condescending, offering people all the information they need to know to understand your perspective. And then finally, you personalize the issue. You connect your own experience to the legislative ask, like I've been stressing over and over again. So some other tips that we got: making a personal connection, finding out, does the lawmaker live in your town? Do they have a family connection to bleeding disorders? The example I'll give here is I learned recently there's a legislator who we have a great rapport with because they have a good friend with psoriasis. So they're very familiar with the condition. They're very familiar with our access to care concerns at NPF because they have that connection. And it might not be a connection like that. It might not be something that's substantive, but just sort of the small icebreakers of, hey, yeah, my kid played on that baseball team, or hey, I've been to that restaurant too. These are a little less applicable when we're working at the federal level, right? Especially if you're talking to a senator. A state's a pretty big area. The representative or the staffer might not, or the senator or the staffer might not know off the top of their head your favorite hot dog place, but you can still use these experiences. They want to know about your town, a little bit about your experiences, and these are just great to open up the meeting. And then the next tip is to explain how your bleeding disorder affects you every day. And again, the point here is not just to limit it to a sort of dry recitation of medical facts, but to make it clear that this is something that affects you in multiple different aspects of your life, because they'll be curious about this and because it illustrates why these issues are so important, right? If you can't have your factor, that will have implications for your education, for your employment, that sort of radiates outward. And this is a good thing to mention when you're telling your story so that you don't make it sound like the issue is separate from your life. It affects multiple aspects of your life. And then finally, like I've been making this point before the slide says I should make it, but you want to connect your experience to access to care. If you've experienced the specific utilization management technique yourself or the specific access to care hurdle yourself, you can talk about that. I know why accumulators are so dangerous for our community because I've experienced them firsthand. If you haven't, you can talk about how it would affect you. How would it affect you? What would happen if you got a bill all of a sudden for $5,000–6,000 that you weren't expecting? So not all of us will have had that firsthand experience, but you can still talk about in hypotheticals and generalities based on your own personal experience. And that's something that we can help you with as well. So this is just a brief outline of your story. You start by introducing yourself and not just sort of who you are, but where you're coming from, the condition you have, how that affects you, all that good stuff. Then you briefly explain the issue. Again, accumulators are very obscure issue I found in Washington. People know about them, but they're not on everyone's radar because they are somewhat specific to us. So this is where we go back to that point about avoiding jargon. You can ask an open-ended questions like, are you familiar with accumulator adjusters? And then tailor your response to what you get back. Then you describe your experience. You make that connection between the issue and the information about yourself that you gave in step one. And then finally, you ask for change. And that's really tailored to who you're talking to as well. If you're talking to someone who's in the specific committee that the bill's held up in, you could say, we'd really love it if you helped us move this through the committee. If you're looking for sponsors and they haven't sponsored, you can ask for that. If they have, you can thank them. And so knowing that extra little bit about who you're talking with will help you tailor this last step to be appropriate to the person. Finally, like I was saying, everyone has a story. Even if you haven't dealt with a specific issue, you might be able to talk in generalities about how you know it's affected other people, or you could talk in hypotheticals about how it would affect you. So even if you haven't dealt with something, don't feel like your story doesn't matter in this context. Here we have an example of two great stories that HFA collected, I believe in the context of fighting ACA repeal, just patients talking about how much the ACA meant to them, various provisions of it, whether that was lifetime caps or staying on your parents' plan until you're 26. And if you want a copy of these, I'm sure Sandra or Miriam, aka my mom, can send them to you. But I think they're just really great examples of this entire process I talked about. Explaining not only who you are and what the issue is, but how the issue would affect you based on your own particular life experience. So the final point I want to hit is this is a little bit different doing it remotely. And like Sandra said at the top, we're not really sure when we're going back to in-person or if we'll go back to in-person. This is something we've been dealing with at NPF as well. But even when we're doing this all virtually, that doesn't mean that you have to totally disconnect. You can call or text your representatives and legislators. You can email or mail. You connect via social media, Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, all the sort of apps that we've all become so familiar with in the last 18 months or so. And then finally, the last resource I want to make special note of is this townhallproject.com, which is a really good resource for finding town halls and other opportunities where you can speak to your lawmakers, ask them questions, get to know them. So the point of this slide is that even though the world is a little bit topsy-turvy right now, there are still ways to get involved with advocacy in a legislative capacity. And if you're ever not sure of how you can get involved, just contact HFA, and I promise you they will find something for you to do because they love, love, love working with all of you. So in conclusion, again, you know all this. I don't know why I'm telling you this, but storytelling really is the heart of what we're doing. It puts a personality behind otherwise remote issues, and it connects real emotion and provides on-hand examples that your legislators can connect with and then even use when they advocate on our behalf. You're the expert as someone either with a bleeding disorder or close to people with bleeding disorders. Ultimately, they want to hear from you in that capacity. It's not that they don't want to hear your opinion on the nitty-gritty of the issue, but rather that they can hear that from other people. So don't feel as if you can't share that, but also don't feel as if you're responsible for every highly technical detail, because that's ultimately not why they're coming to you. They're coming to you because you're constituents and you're people who are affected by these issues on a very direct basis, and they want to learn more about that. So that's really why the perspective we have to share and why we're valuable as people with the condition. Finally, I know this can seem daunting. It can seem a little bit like, well, what's my meeting going to do? But remember that we're not doing this alone. There's a huge network waiting in the wings to help you in HFA. And then even outside of that, there's larger organizations and coalitions all working towards the same goal for people with various conditions and various needs from the healthcare system. So don't feel as if what you have to say is meaningless, because it's incredibly meaningful. You're part of something bigger than yourself. And if we all work together, we can accomplish real change in Washington. So that's my spiel. I really appreciate all of you being here. I'm very sad that I can't be in the meetings tomorrow because I'm going to be at work. So I was like, oh, I wish I could be here. I wish I could be in these meetings getting my hands dirty. But just listening to all of you sort of explain your backgrounds and your perspectives, I know that HFA's virtual fly-in is in great, great hands. And I just want to thank you as someone who can't be in these meetings for what you're doing in them, because you're not just going to Washington on behalf of yourself or on behalf of your kids. You're also doing this on behalf of everyone who can't be there today, can't be there tomorrow, still has the same issues as you, but can't be in the room making that case. So it's a really, really generous and thoughtful thing that you're doing. And on behalf of all of us sort of cheering from the sidelines, thank you, thank you, thank you.